Sir, if you're not on the list, you can't just sit at the piano. This is a performance space. The security guard's voice sliced through Grand Ridge Station, drawing glances from commuters and casting unwanted attention on the weary man in the tattered coat. No one knew who he was. No one expected what came next. But when his fingers touched the keys, the entire station stopped breathing. What began as a moment of humiliation turned into a citywide reckoning. An anonymous pianist's haunting melody awakened tears, memories, and truths long buried. But what shocked everyone even more was the revelation that the old man was Elliott Brandt, a reclusive billionaire composer thought to be lost to time. In a story of redemption, mentorship, and music that transcends generations, a young violinist and a dying maestro form a bond that rewrites both of their lives and composes a hymn that will echo long after the final note. Stay tuned. What you hear may just change the way you live. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Sir, you can't just loiter near the performers. If you're not on the list, you need to step back. The words, though spoken with routine authority, fell like small daggers in the air, sharp enough to make a few commuters glance up from their phones. A uniformed guard stood tall at the velvet rope near the old upright piano by track 7, eyeing the man in the brown wool coat like he was a nuisance rather than a participant. The man didn't flinch. He simply nodded, softly, respectfully, and stepped back into the shadowed fold of the column behind him. The Grand Ridge Central Station was a place of endless footsteps and announcements that barely landed in the minds of the people who passed through. But tonight, it held a different pulse. It was Friday, the first Friday of the month, open mic night. A station initiative meant to bring local vibrancy to a city that was, most days, too hurried to care. Young hopefuls with guitar cases and nervous fingers huddled by the cafe, rehearsing verses under their breath. A couple with matching beanies took selfies near the piano, trying to catch the station's string lights in the background. And standing still in the middle of it all, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, was the man who had just been told to move along. He didn't look like someone worth noticing. His beard was flecked with gray, not the carefully curated kind seen on influencers, but the kind earned through seasons of silence. His shoes were worn down at the heel, and the hem of his coat had caught the city's dust and grime. He looked like a man who belonged in the background, until he looked up. His eyes, beneath the fold of his cap, held something strangely luminous, something weathered but wide awake. But no one noticed that. They never do at first. Near the stage, the host adjusted his mic. He was a lean, sharp-jawed man named Trevor, always dressed like a local radio DJ who thought he deserved to be on television. He scanned the modest crowd and smirked like he owned the oxygen they breathed. "All right, folks," he said, flashing his pearly whites. "Let's get this open mic rolling. And remember, tip your baristas, not your chairs." A forced laugh rose from the back of the cafe. A few performers chuckled nervously, trying to ride the wave of artificial charm. Trevor looked pleased with himself. The first act was a teenage boy who mumbled his name and played a self-written song about heartbreak. He was sweet, earnest, and barely audible over the distant screech of an incoming train. The second act, a girl with electric blue hair and a ukulele, sang a song about coffee and capitalism. She got a few smiles. Then came a stand-up comic who bombed so badly even the janitor pretended not to be listening. Each act passed with a smattering of applause and the kind of polite attention that evaporates the second a phone buzzes. Still, the man in the coat stayed. He watched every single one. Not just watched, listened, as if each note, every off-key lyric meant something. Trevor squinted toward the piano, noticing the old man still standing close by. He leaned into the mic. "Okay, looks like we've got a mystery guest tonight. Sir, unless you're the second coming of Ray Charles, I think it's time we let someone actually signed up take the bench." There was an edge to the laughter this time, meaner, more comfortable in its cruelty. The kind of laughter that comes from a group eager to point fingers at someone less polished than them. The man didn't react. He simply stepped forward, slowly, like the moment had already passed, and he was simply catching up to it. "I'd like to play. Just a few minutes," he said gently, his voice rasped like cedarwood warmed in the sun. "If that's all right." Trevor raised a brow, turned to the sound technician behind the booth with a theatrical shrug. "We've got ourselves a philosopher, folks." A few titters echoed in the crowd. Someone whispered, "Does he even know what key the piano's in?" "I'll be brief," the man said again, this time looking directly at Trevor. There was something in his stillness that unsettled the host. Trevor blinked, took a step back from the mic and waved a dismissive hand. "Sure, why not? 2 minutes, Pops. Don't put us all to sleep." The piano sat like a half-forgotten relic, scuffed on the side, the middle C chipped from years of use. The man approached it not like a musician walking to his instrument, but like a father reaching for a folded photograph buried in an attic drawer. He removed his gloves, slowly, carefully, revealing hands that were neither manicured nor calloused, but strong. Hands that remembered. He sat, adjusted the bench, and placed one hand gently on the keys. Then he stopped. He didn't play. Not yet. He closed his eyes, just for a second, the kind of second that feels like it bends time. Then, a single note, not loud, not dramatic, just true. It rang out and rolled across the tiled floor like a whisper everyone somehow heard. Conversation halted. Even Trevor's expression shifted, confused now. The crowd seemed to lean in, though no one moved. The security guard by the rope took a half step forward. He didn't know why. And then came another note, and another. What unfolded wasn't a song you'd find on Spotify or in any symphony archive. It wasn't rehearsed or flamboyant. It was a memory, unraveled slowly, one aching chord at a time. His left hand stayed low, anchoring each progression in a mournful echo. His right danced higher, not with speed but with grace, like fingertips brushing past old photographs in a dusty shoebox. The melody didn't soar, it wept. Not for drama, but for truth. Within 30 seconds, the entire station was still. Even the barista's hand froze mid-pour. People glanced at one another, eyes wide, brows lifted, asking silently, "Who is he?" The man played with a kind of quiet desperation that broke you slowly. Not with force, but with something worse, recognition. His music stirred the kind of grief people pack away behind their eyes. Regret, lost time, lost children, first loves they never saw again, final goodbyes whispered in hospital rooms, forgiveness never given. A middle-aged woman near the front touched her necklace. A boy leaned against his mother, suddenly unsure why his chest hurt. And somewhere behind the janitor's cart, a young violinist in a beanie blinked rapidly, the corners of her mouth trembling. And the man kept playing. Every keystroke was deliberate. Every note held the weight of something unspoken. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, a folded letter slipped from his coat pocket and drifted gently to the floor, unnoticed. But not by the violinist. She stepped forward, carefully, reverently, and picked it up. Her eyes scanned it, her lips parted, but no sound came. And then she gasped, a single, startled breath. She looked at the man playing, looked again at the letter, and she began to cry. Not a performance, not a trickle. It was a sudden, full collapse. The kind of sob that comes from deep, ancestral places, from wounds never properly healed. She walked forward, knelt beside the bench, and placed the letter next to him. He did not stop playing, but his jaw tightened. His shoulders drew inward, just slightly. The final note was soft, almost too soft to hear. Like a word someone whispers when they no longer expect a response. And then, nothing. The station held its breath. Then the spell broke, not with clapping, but with silence. Real silence. The kind that can only exist after something sacred has been said. For a long moment the station remained suspended, like even the flickering bulbs above the ticket counters forgot how to hum. It wasn't quiet because people were shy or unsure. It was quiet because something in the music had wrapped around the air itself and held it still, like glass not yet shattered. And then, almost shyly, a single pair of hands began to clap. Small, hesitant claps. They belonged to a child, no older than 8, sitting cross-legged near his mother's feet. His palms met in a soft rhythm, unsure but steady. It wasn't the kind of applause that bursts from admiration. It was the kind children give when they feel something too big to explain. And that child's courage opened the floodgates. Another person joined in, then another. Soon the sound of hands echoed off the marble walls. But even this wasn't like the usual applause. It was reverent, raw, a kind of tribute more than celebration. A standing ovation was forming not out of spectacle, but out of awe, and grief, and gratitude. The old man, still seated at the piano, lowered his hands to his lap. He didn't smackly, but his face loosened, as if something had been wound tight in him for years, and now at last it could unravel without snapping. He turned slightly, not to the crowd, but to the girl who had placed the letter beside him. She was kneeling, her hands trembling around the edges of the folded paper. Her name was Elise. She was 19, a conservatory student who came to the station open mic not to perform but to listen, to remind herself why music mattered when grades and technique began to hollow out her soul. And now she couldn't breathe. She glanced down at the letter again. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written through tears or time. To the boy I lost too soon. The ink smudged just past that line as if whoever wrote it had pressed their palm into wet sorrow. I never finished this piece while you were alive. I couldn't. Every note felt like lying. But maybe now it can say what I never could. There was no signature, just a date, 15 years ago. Elise looked up at him. Was it your son? The man looked at her for a moment, and in his eyes she saw a storm that had long since passed but left everything soaked. He gave the smallest nod, her throat constricted. I'm sorry, she whispered, not sure if she meant it for him or the boy, or the pain inside her own chest that suddenly felt too loud. The man reached for the letter, refolded it gently, and slipped it back into his coat. He rose from the bench with the grace of someone who had once performed on great stages but had forgotten what applause ever meant. The host, Trevor, was frozen near the mic stand. His usual smirk dissolved into something smaller. His eyes darted around like he was trying to find a script, but the station had rewritten it without him. Ladies and gentlemen, he finally said, voice catching, I think we just witnessed something extraordinary. His words felt thin, too clean for what had happened. The man had already turned away. Wait, Elise called, stumbling over her own voice. What's your name? He paused but didn't look back. Does it matter? He said gently. The music already spoke it. And with that, he disappeared into the flow of the station, swallowed by a crowd that no longer moved indifferently. People parted as he passed, some with lowered heads, others reaching out just to graze his sleeve, like pilgrims touching the edge of something sacred. Behind him, Elise remained kneeling by the piano, tears still warm on her cheeks, hand resting where his had lingered. And somewhere, Trevor stood motionless, like a boy who'd been handed a book in a language he never bothered to learn. It was a full minute before the spell broke enough for anyone else to step forward. A jazz trio had been next in line, but they exchanged looks of quiet agreement, packed up their cases, and melted into the crowd. No one wanted to follow what had just happened, but someone else did step up, a figure from the side of the station, in a crisp uniform. Officer Miles, the same security guard who had first told the man to step back. His face, typically carved in concrete discipline, now held something fragile. He stared at the piano like it was an altar. And then, to everyone's surprise, he sat down. He touched one key, then another. Clumsy, unsure, but honest. I haven't played since my mother died, he murmured to no one in particular. He struck a third note. It was wrong, sharp and loud, but he didn't stop. He adjusted his fingers and tried again. This time, the sound softened. People watched, not because he played well, but because he tried. Because the music had dared to open a door in him he'd long since locked and forgotten the key. And slowly others came forward, not to play right away, but to place things beside the piano. A flower, a scarf, a small drawing of a piano with wings. Offerings. By the time Elise returned home that night, she still hadn't shaken the sound of that melody. It haunted her, not like a ghost, but like a truth. She didn't sleep. She sat at her own piano until her fingers hurt, trying to remember the way he moved his hands, the way he paused, not for drama, but because silence had things to say too. She played pieces she'd never dared to share with anyone before. They weren't perfect, but they were hers. And in the morning she opened her notebook and wrote, I want to feel what he felt. I want to play like I'm telling the truth. 2 days later she brought the letter to a professor she trusted. They recognized the handwriting. "Are you sure you want to know who he is?" the professor asked softly. Elise nodded, and then she heard the name. A name that didn't belong in train stations or open mics. A name once whispered in elite music circles and then vanished. A name associated with philanthropy, anonymity, and heartbreak. Elliott Brandt, the composer who wrote one perfect concerto and then disappeared the day after it debuted. People thought he'd died. People were wrong. And now, the weight of that discovery settled into Elise's chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Some truths needed to sit in the silence first, the way a final chord echoes just before it's forgotten. But she knew this. She would never play the same again, and neither would anyone who had been in the station that night. Rain came the next morning, soft and unannounced, like a whisper over a city that hadn't yet rubbed the sleep from its eyes. It wasn't the kind of storm that thundered or broke branches. It was gentler, quieter. But to those who'd been at the station the night before, it felt like the world had paused to mourn something it hadn't fully understood. Elise sat by her window, fingers curled around a chipped ceramic mug, watching the droplets thread their way down the glass like tears with nowhere left to go. Her apartment was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the old radiator. Still, inside her, everything pulsed with sound. That melody, it lived behind her eyes now. It didn't leave, not even when she tried to distract herself with tasks or music theory homework or old voice memos from her mother. It hovered in her ribs like a memory she hadn't earned, like a sacred story whispered through keys instead of words. She hadn't told anyone what she saw in that letter. Not her classmates, not her professor, not even the girl she shared her apartment with, who had asked why Elise had come home looking like she'd walked through a dream. Some things felt too holy to be repeated casually over toast. Instead, she printed a picture of Elliott Brandt, the only one she could find, and taped it inside her journal. He looked different in the photograph. Younger, clean-shaven. He was seated at a grand piano, fingers mid-flight, eyes closed, head tilted as if listening for something only he could hear. But the man from the station, he had carried years on his shoulders carved into the lines around his eyes, and yet there was no mistaking it. It was him. The thought alone sent chills down her spine. Because Elliott Brandt wasn't just a pianist, he was legend, myth. The man who'd composed for silence, a piece said to have been written in grief after the loss of his only child. He debuted it once in Vienna, then vanished. No interviews, no recordings, no second performance, just silence. Until now. Until a Friday night in a crowded station where no one expected anything. Elise set her mug down and crossed to her upright piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys. But she didn't play. Not yet. She closed her eyes and tried to hear. Not herself, but him. The way he moved, the way he paused between chords as if listening to the spaces between sounds. When her fingers finally touched the keys, they didn't follow sheet music. They followed something older. Something true. Downstairs, in the old corner cafe that clung to the ground floor of the Music Academy, Trevor was nursing a hangover and a bruised ego. He scrolled through last night's footage on his phone. The video of the mystery man at the piano had already reached 20,000 views overnight, and comments were pouring in, some in awe, some demanding answers, and more than a few asking why the host had tried to embarrass the man. Trevor rubbed his forehead, the shame gnawing like acid behind his temples. He hadn't known. He'd thought the man was just another old wanderer, the kind who drifted through public spaces looking for warmth. He hadn't expected that. That kind of music doesn't just happen. It doesn't bloom in subways or echo under fluorescent lights. And yet, it had. He'd never felt so small. Or so moved. One of the comments under the video caught his eye. "I was there. I've never cried during a piano piece before. I didn't even know I could cry like that." Another, "That man didn't just play music. He pulled ghosts out of us and gave them names." Trevor stared at the screen, something shifting inside him. He didn't know what to do with the feeling. But it wouldn't leave him alone. Not far away, in a quiet corner of the city's West End, Elliott Brandt sat at a park bench just as the rain slowed to a soft drizzle. He'd discarded the cap and coat from the night before, though he still wore his age like a garment he didn't mind anymore. In his hand was a weathered notebook, The pages lined with messy bars of handwritten music, inked over and re-inked, then scratched out again. He hadn't written anything in years, not real music, not from the place that mattered. But something had shifted last night. That girl, Elise, had looked at him with the kind of reverence that didn't seek fame or answers. She'd felt what he played. That's all he'd ever wanted. Not applause, not headlines, just to be understood without words. He ran his fingers over the paper, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel the ache in his wrists, only the urgency in his chest. The piece wasn't finished. Not yet. It was waiting, aching to be born fully. But it wasn't just for his son anymore. It was for everyone who'd ever carried music in their bones and been told they were just noise. He began to write, slowly, carefully. Every note, like a breath. Every rest like a wound stitched closed. By evening, Elise returned to the station. She didn't know why. She just knew she had to. The piano sat there, untouched since the night before. A single rose had been placed atop it, its petals bowed slightly as though in prayer. A small crowd lingered, tourists and passers-by asking questions, playing back recordings on their phones, watching the spot as if it still shimmered with something unseen. Elise sat on the same bench where Elliott had watched the performances. She listened, not for trains or chatter, but for silence. And then, just as the sky turned gold with the setting sun, she opened her case and took out her violin. She didn't plug in a mic. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even check the tuning. She simply played. Not to impress, not to be heard, but to answer. The melody that flowed from her strings wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It carried the DNA of the man's piece, the yearning, the pause, the ache, and it told the world, I heard you, I believe you, I carry it too. A mother with her child stopped. A man in a suit missed his train. 2 guards lowered their radios, and behind them all, unnoticed at first, stood Elliott Brandt. No coat, no disguise, just himself. He didn't interrupt, didn't step forward. He simply watched. And when Elise finished, he placed something quietly on the bench she'd vacated, a single sheet of music, untitled, incomplete. But in the corner, scribbled in the same unsteady handwriting Elise had memorized from the letter, were 3 words. Finish this, together. Elise stood frozen beside the piano, her bow still trembling between her fingers as though the final note hadn't quite let her go. The station noise, that usual symphony of footsteps, departures, and mechanical voices, returned slowly around her. Quiet at first, cautious, as if uncertain whether it had permission to resume. But inside her, everything remained still. She didn't see him at first, only felt something, a stillness different from the rest of the crowd, a kind of presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it through its very restraint. Then she turned, and there he was. Elliott Brandt, no longer hidden beneath a travel-worn coat or obscured by shadow. He stood openly in the soft golden haze of the setting sun, filtering through the iron arches of Grand Ridge Station. His face, now fully visible, carried that same unspoken ache from before, but lighter somehow. Like someone who had taken the first breath after surfacing from a very long time underwater. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Elise looked down. There, on the piano bench beside her violin case, lay a single sheet of handwritten music. Crisp and slightly smudged, folded once across the middle. Her fingers hovered above it, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Then, carefully, she picked it up. The title line was blank. The measures were sparse, tentative, unfinished. Notes trickled across the staves like footprints in snow, hesitant but deliberate. In the bottom right corner, in the same slanted hand she had seen on the letter just nights before, were the words, "Finish this, together." The simplicity of the message made her throat tighten. She looked back up, heart leaping to her lips, but he was gone. Again, not hurriedly, not to avoid her, just vanished, like a candle snuffed gently before morning, leaving only the trace of warmth behind. She clutched the sheet to her chest, a quiet vow forming between her ribs. She would finish it, not to prove herself, not to rise, but because something in her had awakened, something that no syllabus or theory class could have reached. And it came from the raw, open ache Elliott poured into every line. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she walked the streets until the streetlights flickered on, the city's steel bones glowing faintly in the rain. She ended up at the conservatory, her key still working after hours. Inside the old practice room tucked behind the rehearsal halls, she sat down with a pencil, her violin, and the unfinished page, and she listened, not just with her ears, but with her memory. With her soul. Every note he left behind seemed to whisper a question, and she answered. The next morning, word of the man's identity had begun to spread, not through tabloids or news stations, but through the quiet gospel of artists. A whispered name in cafes, a reverent rumor in practice halls, a photograph passed between trembling hands. No one shouted it, no one boasted. The world for once held a secret with care. At Grandridge, more roses had appeared by the piano, not gifts but offerings. Stories attached to petals, notes folded into the shape of wings. A child's crayon drawing of the man playing beneath a glowing halo. Trevor arrived that afternoon, holding 2 cups of coffee but drinking neither. He sat by the bench and watched as a teenage boy sat down and clumsily tried to play the opening chords of the mystery melody from the now viral video. He hit all the wrong notes, paused to mutter apologies to the keys, and then chuckled. Trevor smiled, not because the playing was good, but because the piano was finally alive. The station was no longer just a place for transit. It had become a place of pilgrimage. And Trevor was starting to understand that his job was never about being the center of attention. It was about being the light that revealed others. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found one labeled simply E. Brandt. He didn't remember adding it, but it was there. Probably left from the time he'd worked a fundraiser 4 years ago and been given a contact sheet of patrons too important to approach. He stared at the number. Then he wrote one message. "Thank you for reminding us what music is supposed to do." He didn't expect a reply. He never got one. But he smiled anyway. Across the city, in a building older than most of the dreams it had ever housed, Elliott sat beside a grand piano once used by a composer long dead. Dust motes swirled around him as he ran his fingers gently over the keys. Not playing, not yet, just remembering. A music journalist had reached out earlier that day. She wanted an interview, a story, a return. He declined. He didn't owe the world a comeback. But he did owe one thing. The melody wasn't finished. And now, he wasn't finishing it alone. He placed Elise's rewritten bars beside his own, studying the shift in tone, the subtle bravery in her phrasing. She had taken his grief and shaped it into something new, not lighter, but wider, as if the song had learned to breathe again. He lifted a pencil and gently marked a few notes, not as corrections, but as responses, like 2 souls writing letters across time. That evening, Elise received a package on her doorstep. It was a stack of bound pages, sheet music, carefully handwritten. On the cover was a title now etched in full, "For the Ones Who Stayed." And beneath it, composed by Elliott Brandt and Elise Moreau. Inside the package was a short note. "The stage is yours now. I'll be listening, from somewhere near." Her hands shook, she sat down. Then she wept, not because she felt overwhelmed, but because she finally felt heard. At that very hour, under the warm glow of amber station lights, a new open mic began. People had started arriving earlier now, not to claim better seats, but to spend a few quiet minutes beside the piano before the music started. And just before the host could step up to the mic, Elise appeared from the back, violin in hand, shoulders tall, eyes luminous. She didn't wait for applause, she didn't give an introduction, she raised her bow, and she played the first completed movement of "For the Ones Who Stayed." The station fell silent once more, but this time the silence was not stunned or sorrowful. It was sacred. And somewhere, far from the lights and eyes, Elliott closed his eyes, placed a hand over his heart and smiled. Because music had returned, not just to the station, but to him. The final note hung in the air like breath suspended just before a kiss, fragile, full of unsaid things, trembling in the hush of Grandridge Station. Elise's bow slowed to a still point, hovering above the last vibrating string of her violin, and for one infinite heartbeat, no one moved. Not the woman clasping a sleeping infant near the corner bench, not the conductor paused on the escalator steps, not the young man who had quietly stopped mid-stride, mouth parted as though afraid even a breath might startle the silence away. Then, without cue or command, the sound of hands began to rise. But it was not the applause of a crowd dazzled by performance. It was the response of people who had remembered something they didn't know they'd forgotten. Applause like a prayer, like a thank you spoken in a language deeper than words. Elise's eyes welled, but didn't spill. She bowed her head with reverence, not pride, not triumph. Reverence. For the music, for the moment, for the man who had passed her a flame he had carried alone for too many years. She stepped back from the piano and violin stand and caught a glimpse of Trevor near the back. He looked different these days, softer in the eyes, less tightly wrapped in his ego. He'd started volunteering at the conservatory outreach program. He nodded at her now, not with arrogance, but with quiet recognition. He had become a witness, not a gatekeeper. Elise packed her violin slowly, each movement thoughtful. Then she slid the original page, Elliott's sheet, back into its folder. As she zipped her case, something warm brushed past her, a hand. A little girl, no older than 7, with a missing front tooth and braids like musical notes, offered her a paper flower. "It made my tummy feel funny," the girl said solemnly. "Like when my grandma used to sing me to sleep." Elise smiled, tears finally surfacing. "That's how I felt too." That night she couldn't sleep. The music didn't let her. Not in a haunting way, but in the way certain stars demand to be followed. She pulled the piece back out and laid it flat beneath her lamp. The pages now held more than melody. They held history, grief, reconciliation, 2 lives braided together between clefts and rests. She didn't want to stop there. Something told her Elliott hadn't either. With trembling hands she picked up her pencil. What if the second movement isn't about loss, she thought. What if it's about remembering? Not to ache, but to honor. She began to sketch a theme. It wasn't sorrowful. It was reflective. Still tinted by shadows, yes, but more like leaves falling in slow circles than a storm. Something that let the listener breathe. Hours passed unnoticed. And somewhere across the city, in a modest 3rd-floor apartment tucked behind an old bookstore, Elliott stood alone, staring out a rain-fogged window, the edge of a cello suite humming through his thoughts. He had played the recording of Elise's performance 3 times already, each time stopping before the end, just to hold on to the moment before resolution. He hadn't intended for this. He hadn't planned for her. But she had walked through the very space he'd sealed off. And not only had she understood it, she'd added light. He poured tea into a cracked mug and settled at the piano that hadn't been tuned in over a year. His fingers didn't need perfect pitch anymore. They needed memory. He played the beginning of her second movement. She'd emailed him a recording that morning with a simple subject line, "Maybe this comes next?" It did. He smiled, tracing the melody. When he reached the final phrase, he paused, then added 2 quiet chords, as though answering. The next day, Elise walked through Grand Ridge Station holding something different. Not just music, but direction. She had started writing again, not for classes, not for credits, for herself, and for the man who believed in what she had to say. She found a bench in the far corner and opened her notebook, sketching notes between train announcements and rustling coffee cups. People passed. A few stopped to greet her, others to listen. But one man sat down beside her and said nothing for a while. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. "I thought you didn't like crowded places," she murmured, her pencil still moving. "I don't," Elliott replied, his tone dry but amused. "But I realized I like listening more than hiding." She turned to him then, fully. The lines in his face looked deeper today, but less heavy, like they were finally settling where they belonged. "I've been working on the second movement." "I know," he said with a quiet smile. "I heard it in my sleep. Do you want to hear it properly?" He nodded once. She led him to the piano, and this time she didn't play alone. They sat side by side, 2 generations stitched together by silence and sound. He took the low end, she took the high. Their hands moved like mirrors, not in technique, but in understanding. And the station stopped again. People didn't recognize him at first. They saw an old man beside a young woman, both immersed in a melody too delicate for interruption. But then someone whispered it. The name. And like a ripple through still water, realization spread. Elliott Brandt was not lost. He had returned, but not in the way people expected. He hadn't come back to reclaim the stage. He'd come back to pass the music on. And Elise had become the new keeper of the flame. By the time they finished, no one clapped. Not right away. Some had tears, others just stared. But there was something deeper than praise in the room. There was gratitude. Elise looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a moment, neither had anything to say. Because music had said it all. Later that week, a small announcement made its way to music circles across the country. Elliott Brandt and Elise Moreau to premiere collaborative work at Lincoln Hall this spring. All proceeds to benefit arts education for underserved youth. It didn't go viral, it didn't trend, but it found the right ears. And in classrooms, where children didn't yet know who either of them were, they would soon hear music that was born not from perfection, but from pain, from hope, from the quiet bravery of choosing to play again. The day of the Lincoln Hall premiere arrived like a held breath finally exhaled. Rain had threatened in the early hours, brushing the streets with silver mist. But by afternoon, the sky softened into that kind of reluctant blue that only comes when the weather itself is unsure whether to weep or shine. Outside the grand concert hall, a quiet crowd gathered. Older couples dressed in thoughtful evening wear, young musicians clutching notebooks and eyes full of longing, students from local conservatories with their ticket stubs folded tightly like prayers in their palms. The posters outside were simple. No grandeur, just two names in slender white font against a deep black background: Elliott Brandt and Elise Moreau. For the ones who stayed there was no subtitle, no dramatic tagline, because those who came already knew. Inside the hall, Elise stood in the dim backstage corridor, her back pressed lightly against the cool stone wall, violin case still unopened by her side. She had been silent for the last 15 minutes, not from nerves, but from reverence. The low hum of the audience settling in floated through the velvet curtains and carved wood. The sound wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the bones, an energy alive with expectation. She closed her eyes. She thought of the station, of the chipped piano, of the single folded letter that had started all of this. And then she thought of him. Elliott. He stood just a few feet away, his silhouette barely lit beneath a sconce above the exit sign. He was adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, not out of vanity, but like a man putting on a uniform he hadn't worn in years. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were still. "Elise," he said softly, almost like a question. She turned to him, her expression open, steady. "I never thought I'd walk out on that stage again," he murmured. She nodded. "But you're not walking out alone." He met her eyes. In them, he saw something deeper than admiration. He saw understanding. And something unspoken passed between them, as real as any signature. The house lights dimmed. The low murmur of the audience thinned into silence. And from somewhere deep in the theater, the old Steinway was waiting. Elliott stepped into the wings first, the crowd's breath catching the moment he came into view. Some gasped, others covered their mouths, and yet no one clapped, not out of rudeness, but out of disbelief. It was as if time itself had reversed. He crossed the stage slowly, his posture upright, but his steps unhurried. He bowed briefly, then took a seat at the piano. Then Elise stepped into the light. The reaction this time was different. A wave of warmth rolled through the theater. Some knew her face, others only knew her sound. But they all felt the same thing. This was no understudy. This was a voice. She didn't bow. She didn't need to. She walked to center stage and lifted her violin to her shoulder, her bow angled toward the waiting breath of the audience. And then, nothing. Stillness. For a moment so quiet you could hear the flicker of the chandeliers above. Then Elliott's hands moved. The opening chord unfolded not with fanfare but with the soft ache of memory. It was the same melody he had played at the station that night, but not exactly. This time it had layers, wounds stitched into lullabies. Grief that had been named and now grieved. When Elise entered, it was like a thread of sunlight winding through a dark forest. Her violin voice didn't overpower. It responded, echoed, sometimes hesitated, sometimes led. It was not a duet of two egos, but of two hearts breathing the same language. The first movement rose and fell in waves, tension and surrender, sorrow and grace. And when they reached the final measures, Elise drew her bow slow and steady, letting the note linger like the softest goodbye. The silence after was not empty. It was full of everything that hadn't been said, but had now been heard. Then came the second movement, the one they'd written together. And something changed. It began not in pain, but in curiosity. A question asked gently, like a hand extended in trust. The piano responded not with answers, but with stories. Elise's violin spun those stories into threads of resilience. Music that climbed, faltered, but never gave up. At one point, the melody circled back to the original theme, but this time it bloomed. Not with resolution, but with quiet acceptance. The kind that says, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. But I am still here. By the time they reached the final chord, something had shifted in the room. People were not just moved, they were changed. And still, no one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Not yet. Because music like that doesn't end with noise. It ends with knowing. When they stood and bowed together, hands lightly joined, the applause finally came. But it wasn't thunderous. It was something better. It was intimate, grateful, human. Afterward, in the modest dressing room with the flickering mirror lights, Elliott sat on the small sofa with his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing like someone who had just climbed a long mountain and was finally standing at the summit. Elise entered, her cheeks flushed, the sheet music clutched to her chest. "You okay?" she asked softly. He opened his eyes, a tired smile dancing at the corners of his lips. "I didn't expect to still be standing," he murmured. She chuckled, walked to him, and handed him the sheet music. "You were more than standing. You flew." He looked at the pages, then at her. "And you finished the melody." "We finished it?" she corrected gently. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young girl stood there, no more than 15, holding a program in one hand and a violin case in the other. Her eyes were wide with awe, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Excuse me, I wanted to say thank you. I never knew music could feel like that." Elise smiled and stepped aside, motioning for the girl to come closer. Elliott straightened in his seat. "What's your name?" "Ria," she said. "I want to be a composer." "You already are," he said. "You just haven't written it yet." Tears filled the girl's eyes, and Elise saw it then, the future passing quietly into the room. Another fire lit, another hand extended. After the girl left, Elise turned to Elliott. "I think you just started something you can't stop." He exhaled softly, then nodded. "Then let's not stop." The days that followed the Lincoln Hall performance were quiet, in the way freshly fallen snow is quiet, full of soundless change, of delicate shifts beneath the surface. The world didn't erupt in fireworks, headlines didn't scream, but for those who had sat in that hushed auditorium, who had heard Elliott's hands return to the keys and Elise's bow carve light through silence, something had shifted. Not just in music. In them. Across the city, ripples moved through conservatories and living rooms, through nursing homes and train stations, through cafes where struggling artists nursed bitter coffee and stubborn hope. Somewhere, a boy dusted off the cello case he hadn't opened in 3 years. A widow played her husband's favorite sonata for the first time since he passed. A subway violinist added a new piece to her repertoire, one inspired by the theme she'd heard at Grand Ridge Station. Elise, too, felt the shift, but hers wasn't outward, it was internal, intimate, a sensation like suddenly waking to find your own heart singing back to you. Every time she touched the strings now, something new stirred beneath her fingertips. Not perfection, not performance, purpose. She'd begun composing again, obsessively, filling notebooks with fragmented ideas, some elegant, some raw, some entirely unshaped, but all alive. And beneath each new phrase in the margins, she scribbled one name again and again: Elliott. She didn't mean to idolize him, he wouldn't have allowed it anyway. But she couldn't deny what he had become to her. Not a mentor, not a ghost, but a mirror, a witness to the ache she never quite knew how to name. And then came the letter. It arrived one Thursday morning, slipped through the slit of her studio door like a whisper. No envelope, just a folded page, creased neatly, the kind of paper musicians used to sketch ideas before computers tried to steal the intimacy away. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Elise, I've been offered an invitation I can't ignore. There's a boys' choir in Prague, a school where my son was once meant to study. They've asked me to write something for their memorial winter concert. I want it to be the last piece I ever write. But I don't want to write it alone. Meet me at the station. Friday, 7 p.m. Let's begin again." Her breath caught. She read it again, and for a full minute she forgot how to breathe. Friday came with the soft promise of snowfall, not heavy yet, just flakes drifting like notes across the skin of the sky. Elise wrapped herself in a thick scarf, her violin case slung over her shoulder, fingers twitching with anticipation and some small, nervous awe. Grandridge Station hadn't changed, and yet it felt new. The chipped piano was still there, same scuffs along the legs, same faded logo above the keys. But around it, something had formed. A kind of sacred boundary, not drawn by ropes or signs, but by memory. People no longer placed coffee cups on it. Children passed by it quietly, parents whispering, "That's the piano they played." And there he was. Elliott, seated on the bench like he'd never left, his coat draped over the edge, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. He looked up when he saw her. No smile, but his eyes softened. That was enough. She joined him without a word, set her case beside the bench, sat down beside him. For a long time, they said nothing. Because some reunions don't begin with greetings, they begin with breath, with silence shared. Finally, Elliott reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded page. It was worn already, the corners soft, the lines of ink bleeding slightly from where fingertips had held them too long. "I wrote a motif," he said. "Something small, a seed." He handed it to her. She scanned the notes, heart quickening. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice almost breaking. "But it's unfinished." "I know," he said, eyes flickering to her like a challenge. "That's why I gave it to you." She exhaled softly and opened her case. The chill in the air made her bow hand tremble at first, but the moment her fingers found the strings, her body remembered. She played the motif gently, the notes fragile as falling ash. Then, without asking, she added, a second voice, an answer, a continuation. Elliott listened. And then, he joined her. He didn't play with grandeur, he didn't try to impress. He played like a man writing a letter to his past and handing it to the wind. Together, they began shaping something raw and holy. The melody swelled, collapsed, then rebuilt itself. They tested harmonies, bent time, let dissonance linger longer than polite music would allow, and always, beneath the notes, was the ache of memory, but also the quiet joy of return. Commuters stopped. A janitor leaned his broom against a trash can and just stood there. A child dropped a juice box and never picked it back up. Even the station manager, a woman known more for her punctuality than her poetry, removed her headset and just listened. And when the music slowed, when the final phrase began to unfurl, a hush fell like snow over the crowd. Elise met Elliott's eyes, and together, they stopped. Not because the piece was finished, but because they were. For now, silence expanded, respectful and wide. Then came a sound neither of them expected. The sound of someone crying. A guard, the same one who once scolded Elliott months ago for standing too close to the open mic zone, stood in the back, hand over his mouth, eyes flooded. He nodded at Elliott. Then at Elise, like a benediction, like a confession. They didn't bow, they didn't speak. They simply stood, packed up, and walked together into the falling snow. Their footsteps vanished behind them. But the music didn't. It lingered. Inside every witness, inside every empty bench, inside every silence that once feared being alone. The snow thickened by the hour, coating the sidewalks like a blanket laid gently over old wounds. Streetlights cast warm halos through the falling white, and the hush it brought over the city seemed too complete for the modern world. No horns, no shouts, just the occasional crunch of boots and the soft whisper of a wind that carried more memory than cold. Elise walked beside Elliott, their silence companionable, not strained. The music still clung to her skin, like the last trace of a dream not yet wiped from the eyes. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. He led her past shuttered bookstores and sleeping cafes, through a wrought iron gate half buried in snow, and down a narrow alley whose walls echoed with every footstep. They arrived at a modest stone building, a conservatory annex she had only ever heard about in passing. A place where once, decades ago, Elliott had taught for a brief spell before fame swept him away and silence swallowed him whole. He opened the door with an old brass key worn nearly smooth. The inside was warm, dim, quiet. Dust floated in lazy spirals beneath high rafters. A grand piano stood at the center of a small room lined with empty chairs. No signs, no plaques, just wood and silence and the unmistakable scent of aged parchment. "This is where he used to sit," Elliott murmured, gesturing to a bench in the corner. "My son, before lessons." Elise turned, heart tightening. Elliott moved slowly across the floor, not like a man revisiting a place, but like a man unburying it. He traced a finger along the edge of the piano lid. Then he sat. "She was the one who taught him," he said quietly. "Maria?" Elise remembered the name, Maria Elbin, a composer known in only a few circles but revered in every one of them. She died just after Elliott's son. Some had said she never recovered from the grief. "She once told me," he continued, "that music isn't about filling silence. It's about revealing what's already in it." He looked up at her, his eyes clear but dark with something she couldn't quite name. "Elise," he said, "I don't have much time." The words landed like frost across her chest. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers as if to test whether they still belonged to him. "My body's been quiet about it, but the doctors haven't. There's something in my blood, something slow, but steady. They've given me time, but not a lot of it." She blinked hard. He went on before she could speak. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want the music to come from pity. I wanted it to be honest. I wanted you to be honest, and you have been." Tears welled behind her eyes, sharp and sudden, but she swallowed them. "So why Prague?" she asked softly, voice brittle. "Because that's where the echo ends," he said. "That's where I was supposed to take him. The winter concert was going to be his debut. I canceled the flight 2 days before. He got sick anyway. The irony, I suppose, is that the music arrived before we ever got there." Elise sat across from him, her violin resting on her lap like a sleeping creature. "We'll finish the piece," she whispered. "Together." He nodded. "But I want you to conduct it when the time comes." She looked up sharply. "No, Elliott, that's your." He reached across the piano, his hand gentle but certain. "It's ours now, and when I'm no longer here, it will be yours, and then someone else's. That's how music lives, through hands, through breath, through those who choose to listen." A tear escaped down her cheek, hot against the chill still clinging to her skin. He pulled a stack of handwritten pages from his coat, pages he'd been carrying for months, refining between doctor visits and sleepless nights. "It's not done," he said. "But it's close. The Prague concert is 6 weeks away. If we write it together now, we can offer them something worthy." Elise looked at the pages, swells of melody, ghosts of themes born in a train station and whispered into wood and string. She wiped her cheek, straightened her back. "Then we start tonight." And they did. Night turned to dawn inside that little conservatory, but neither noticed. Coffee cups went cold, candles melted into waxy puddles, but the music grew, line by line, phrase by phrase. Elliott at the piano, Elise on the floor with pages spread around her like maps of a world only they could see. They wrote in silence. They wrote in laughter. They wrote through quiet grief and wordless joy. And when they finally stepped back, bleary-eyed and shaking, they saw it. The winter hymn. A requiem for a boy who never saw the stage. A benediction for the girl who made the music speak again. 6 weeks passed in a blur of rehearsals, recordings, and letters exchanged across oceans. The Prague Conservatory accepted the submission with reverent astonishment. A hall once built by candlelight and cathedral stone was being readied, not for spectacle, but for something far more sacred. The night before the performance, Elise stood alone on the terrace of their hotel overlooking the Vltava River. Snow drifted quietly down, resting on statues older than memory. The bells of Old Town chimed midnight. She turned. Elliott had fallen asleep in the armchair beside the window, his chest rising slowly, his face lit by the last flicker of candlelight. She watched him for a long time, not as a student, not as a composer, as someone who had been found. The next night, beneath vaulted ceilings and gold-lit balconies, a boys' choir began to sing. Their voices rose like snow melt in spring, fragile, crystalline, breathtaking. The orchestra followed, led not by a famous conductor, but by Elise Moreau, hands trembling with meaning, her heart a metronome beating in time with every soul that had once been silenced. And in the final movement, when the last echo of the cello faded into quiet, Elise turned toward the wings, where Elliott stood, eyes glistening, mouth whispering the final words of the piece, "Stay." There are some silences that feel sacred, not because they are empty, but because they are full, so full of presence, of ache, of reverence, that no sound dares disturb them. The silence after the winter hymn ended was like that. Inside Prague's ancient hall, every breath was held captive in the moment that followed the final note. The cathedral arched ceiling bore witness to the last echoes still trembling in the rafters, while down below, hundreds sat motionless, unable or unwilling to move. Even the youngest boys in the choir stood frozen in their white robes, eyes wide, cheeks flushed from the final crescendo. Some of them didn't even fully understand what they'd just been part of. But they felt it. Everyone did. Elise stood at the conductor's podium, her arms lowered now, the baton slack in her right hand. Her chest rose and fell slowly, heavily, like someone just waking from a dream they don't want to leave. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked to the side stage, to the shadowed wings, to the man standing just out of the light. Elliott, he didn't move, didn't smile, didn't weep. He just watched, as if seeing something he thought he never would, as if recognizing something that had for so long been missing from the world and from himself. She bowed then, not with grandeur, not like a star, but with quiet gratitude, arms crossing softly before her, as if offering the entire audience a single final breath. The applause came slowly, not timid, tender, and then it built, swelled, surged. It was the kind of applause not just for excellence, but for redemption. A woman in the back wiped tears from her glasses. A boy in the front row stood up without realizing it. The head of the Prague Conservatory pressed a hand to his chest and whispered something to the person beside him, something that looked like a prayer. Elliott stepped forward, but only slightly, enough to be seen. The crowd erupted anew, recognizing him at last. It was the first time he had stood under concert lights in over 2 decades. And it would be the last. But no one knew that yet. Not even Elise. After the performance, there was no lavish party. No red carpets or velvet ropes. Just a small reception in the old courtyard, where snow danced around heated lanterns and conversations happened in half-whispers. Elise stood near the fountain, sipping warm cider someone had handed her. Her hands were still shaking slightly, not from nerves, but from stillness. From the weight of what had just been poured out of her soul and into the world. Elliott approached quietly, as he always did. She turned before he spoke. "I didn't know what to expect," she said softly. He smiled faintly, brushing snow from his shoulder. "Neither did I." There was a pause. Then she stepped closer, her voice low. "Did it feel like enough?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up, toward the old clock tower above the courtyard. Its hands read 10:03 p.m. Then he looked back at her. "It felt like the beginning of an ending," he said, "and the ending of a silence I'd carried far too long." She looked down, swallowing the tightness rising in her throat. "I saw your lips," she whispered. "At the end, you said something." He met her eyes. "I said stay." Her brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because," he began, then stopped. His gaze drifted to the fountain where snow was melting against warm stone. "Because part of me wanted to leave, right then, as the music ended, just vanish into the last note. But when I saw you, I realized I wanted one more night." Elise couldn't speak, so she nodded, and for a long moment they just stood there, letting the snow fall between them. Later that night, in their shared hotel suite overlooking the Vltava River, Elise sat at the window with her journal, writing by the flicker of candlelight. She didn't know what she was writing, just that it needed to be remembered. Elliott sat behind her in the armchair again, wrapped in his old cardigan, his eyes closed. Not asleep, but resting. Breathing. Listening to something only he could hear. "Elise," he said softly. She turned. "Promise me something. Anything. When they talk about me after I'm gone, when they dust off my name and hang it on some wall, remind them I didn't come back to be remembered. I came back to remember him. And through that, I remembered myself." Tears slipped down her cheek. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes still closed. And then, after a moment, "Will you play?" She rose without speaking, took her violin and sat by the window. No music stand. No sheet. Just memory. She began to play the first movement of the winter hymn, softly, delicately. The melody floated across the room, brushing past the flickering shadows on the walls, curling around the armchair, folding into the hush like a lullaby. And when she reached the end, when the final note fell into silence, she turned. He was still, not asleep, not gone, just still. And he was smiling. She wept then, not with sorrow, but with awe. Because there are some endings that do not close doors but open windows. Elliott Brandt left not in darkness, not in silence, but in music. In the hands of a young woman who once played in a train station, trembling with self-doubt. and now stood holding the legacy of a man who taught her that broken people make the most beautiful instruments. The morning arrived without asking. The sun climbed gently over Prague's rooftops, soft gold stretching across a city not yet fully awake. The bells of a distant church murmured into the hush, but they rang differently now. Slower, fuller, as if even they understood that something sacred had passed in the night. Inside the suite, light fell across the quiet room where Elise sat by the window, knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in the cardigan Elliott had left draped across the chair. It smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and it held a weight that she wasn't ready to put down. He was gone. She had known the moment she finished the last note of the hymn. Before she turned, before she saw. And yet somehow, he'd left peace behind. Not absence, peace. The kind of peace that comes when someone finishes what they came into this world to do. She hadn't slept. She couldn't, but her exhaustion didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Every hour that passed since the final note in the courtyard, since that soft, still smile, felt like time repaying a debt. On the desk sat a letter folded neatly, the ink just beginning to dry. She hadn't opened it yet. Not because she feared what it said, but because she wanted to deserve it. She reached for it now, her fingers trembling slightly as she peeled the edges open. Inside, in his unmistakable slant, were words that would live in her forever. Elise, I once believed that silence was the safest place for grief, that hiding away in the spaces between sound would keep me from breaking. I was wrong. You showed me that music doesn't just heal, it resurrects. You are not my student, you are my echo, my answer, my continuation. Don't let them cage you in laurels or traditions or expectations. Let them feel you, make them listen. This world needs fewer performers and more truth-tellers. You are one. Thank you for saving my last song. Let it be your first. Yours in every note, Elliott. She pressed the letter to her chest and let the tears come, not sharp, not sudden, just quiet, steady, like the end of a long, kind rain. Later that day, she stood beside his casket in the private ceremony arranged by the Prague Conservatory. There were no speeches, no pomp, just music. The boys' choir stood in white robes again, their voices rising in soft harmony, the same notes from the winter hymn, but sung now like a farewell. A letting go. Elise didn't speak, she played. A single violin, no accompaniment, no spotlight. Just her and the wind. And when the bow left the string, when the final vibration vanished into the stone courtyard, she turned to the crowd and nodded once. Not as goodbye, but as invitation. She had one more promise to keep. 1 month later, she returned to Grandridge Station. It was raining again. Not heavily, just enough to mist the windows and wrap the city in quiet. The piano still stood under the flickering string lights, a fresh coat of polish now gleaming beneath the overhead lamps. Someone had placed a small brass plaque at its side, in memory of Elliott Brandt, the man who made silence sing again. Elise approached with her case, the whisper of her footsteps barely louder than the rain. A few people looked up. A woman reached for her child's hand. A man lowered his newspaper. She sat down, opened the case, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She played the winter hymn, alone. No choir, no orchestra, just wood and string and heart. And Grandridge Station, where it all began, held its breath once more. The same way it had the night, a quiet old man in a worn coat sat at a chipped piano and changed everything. When she finished, she closed her eyes, and in that stillness, she could almost hear him beside her again. Not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as a note carried forward. And then she heard footsteps. Small ones. She turned. A boy, no older than 10, stood holding a notebook and a pencil, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. "Miss," he asked softly, "can you teach me how to play something that makes people feel like that?" She smiled, blinking away the sudden blur in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why I'm here." In the weeks that followed, the station changed. A chalkboard appeared beside the piano. Open bench, open hearts. Musicians came, some young, some old, some timid, some bold, but all of them shared something now: permission. To try, to feel, to be heard. And in the corner of every performance, Elise sat quietly listening. Not correcting, just witnessing. Because once, someone had done that for her. And now it was her turn to keep the song going. Not the notes, the truth. The echo of hands passed across time, of grief turned into grace, of a silence that, when met with courage, had become a hymn that would never fade. To anyone who's ever been silenced by grief, by doubt, or by a world too loud to hear your quiet song, this story is for you. The Winter Hymn wasn't just a piece of music. It was a reminder that even the most broken hearts can still compose beauty. Elliott Brandt spent years hiding in silence, believing his pain had no place in the world of sound. But through a young woman's courage and her unwavering belief in the power of unfinished things, he found his way back. Not to the spotlight, but to peace. This isn't a story about fame, it's about legacy, about how the most powerful compositions in life are the ones we share. Not for applause, but for healing. So if you're carrying something too heavy to speak, pick up your instrument, whatever it may be, and let it say what your voice cannot. Because in a world that often forgets how to listen, truth wrapped in music will always find its way through. Remember this. You don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You just have to play what's real. And sometimes the most beautiful melodies begin with a single broken note.